Greetings. A warm welcome to all of you, my dear sisters and brothers and my dear friends. Welcome in another evening with God. This is Reverend Yeti. Today I'm going to talk about choices. We can compare the journey toward God to the passage of the Israelites through the desert into the promised land. We begin our journey in life with a desire for happiness and peace, but we must pass through the desert, trusting that God who calls us is with us and will lead us to the promise of life. Traveling through the desert, however, is difficult because the desert is desolate and filled with the terror of darkness, silence, thirst, and attacks by wild creatures. We find examples of revelation time in scriptures in the call of Matthew, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Matthew 9, verse 9. And in the story of St. Paul, who was knocked off his horse, blinded, and addressed by Christ himself, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." Acts 9, verses 5 to 6. A grace-filled moment of revelation is the clearest type of discernment, since there is a little doubt about God's will. Rather, God imprints a certain and firm direction in the heart, and there is really nothing one can do to ignore or avoid it. Decisions in life would be crystal clear if they proceed on daily revelation alone. However, the way of revelation is the exception and not the norm. More properly defined as discernment in this way, light and knowledge are received by experience of consolations and desolations, and by the experience of the discernment of various spirits. This way is a combination of both reason and prayer, patiently waiting for the light of God to direct us and conform us in our decisions. The person who has made it ought to go with much diligence to prayer before God our Lord, and offer him such election that his divine majesty may be pleased to receive and confirm it, if it is to his greater service and praise. We can have a time of great uncertainty concerning God's will. The two are similar in that in both cases there is nothing to discern. This nothing is a frustration, nothing that is, in contrast with the clarity and certainty of the revelation time, Here God does not seem to be saying anything to the soul sincerely seeking His will. It could be a way of time of peacefulness when the soul is not acted on by various spirits and uses its natural powers freely and tranquilly. The use of the word tranquility here does not mean peace, but the ability to use one's natural powers of reasoning and imaginations to weigh the pros and cons of the situation and come to a reasonable decision concerning God's will. One might see here God's respect of the human intellect and freedom to choose. We are not only asked to pray for light and courage, but we are asked to use our intellect to weigh the matters before us with care and fidelity. We need to weigh the alternatives. Which choice seems reasonable and gives me peace of mind and heart? What are the reasons for my decision? Are they selfish reasons? Or do they flow from deep prayer and honesty with God? How would I advise another person facing the same choice? Would I make this choice on my deathbed? Can I live with this choice as I face God and the last day or the final judgment? Sometimes decisions become clear as we weigh the pros and cons or try to advise someone else in a similar situation. How often have we given advice to others, and upon hearing it said, "How strange, I have said that to others. Why could I not see it as relevant to myself?" The reason is that we find it difficult to distance ourselves from our own problems and to look at them objectively. That is why when we live in spiritual poverty and humility, in spiritual openness, we can see ourselves reflected better in others than in ourselves. For the other is a reflection of ourselves. The other is a mirror of God. The use of the intellect and reason in discerning the will of God is important to highlight the role of the heart. The effective capacity of the human person, that is the human person's potential to be moved by desire for the good. Human desire is directed at nothing but the supreme good, or that which leads to it or reflects the good in a certain way. Since desire is born in the human heart, to enter into the heart is to be attentive to one's inner feelings and movements and to confront these feelings and movements honestly. One might speak of obedience to the heart as listening attentively to the small voices that speaks within us and directs us to what is closest to the highest good. And if we stop trying to control our lives and open up to the grace of God. Only when the heart is free can one then choose a path in life, trusting that the goodness of God will enlighten this journey. Consolation. Although we may not hear God speaking to us most of the time and are unsure whether or not we are really following God, there are signs of God's intimate presence with us. However, we first have to realize that God does not shout or scream. God does not make loud sounds or dramatic changes to show His presence. Rather, God speaks most eloquently in stillness and silence. God speaks most clearly in silence. In fact, the more language we need to talk about God, the further away we are from God. The closer we come to God, the fewer words we need to speak of God, as when two people who have known each other for such a long time that presence, not conversation, is usually the language between them. God is closer to each of us than we are to ourselves. The mystery of God is so profound and incomprehensible that words fail to describe God. The closer God is to us, the less we can really describe this divine presence in words that convey the depth of the experience of God. So how do we know we are in right relationship with God? How do we know we are living the will of God? We know by movements within the soul that indicate the nearness of God. We can identify the right path when we experience consolation within us that is usually marked by great love of God, or a feeling of peace or joy. We know this feeling not as an ordinary feeling, but one that can surprise us by its depth and power. But we can also experience consolation when one sheds tears out of love of God because of sorrow for sins. Because of the sufferings of Christ our Lord, or for any other reason that is immediately directed to the praise and service of God. However, we experience consolation either through deep peace or tears. Such consolation increases one's faith, hope, and love, and acts as an invitation to love, praise, and glorify God. Consolation is the grace of God welling up within us, filling us with an ineffable heart of love. Our only true response can be a greater act of love. How do we know God is present to us and we are in right relationship with God? An increased love of God, compunction, or a sense of sorrow for one's sin, an increase of faith and hope, joy, peace, and quite deep within the soul, or the deepest center of one's being. The common denominator for discernment, the will of God, is peace in the Lord. Whether the soul be deeply or strongly moved, as in the emotional reunion of two lovers after a long separation, or quietly consoled, as might be the experience of a mother gazing on and her newborn baby, and quietly marveling at the wonder of life which has come from her body. Our emotions cannot form our complete litmus test with God, as many factors influence our emotional life, and nonetheless, they are essential to the spiritual life and to discerning God's will for us. As in any relationship, feelings are crucial, and this is no less true for a relationship with God. Feelings or emotions are our raw data, and which we reflect as we evaluate them with our intellect to discern the will of God. The intellect helps us sort through the complexity of our emotions so that when the forces of life become like gale storms, we still sense deep within us a certain peace that signifies the will of God. Thus we know we are living in the will of God when at the end of a day we can pray with a deep sense of gratitude and peace for all that has been, thanks, for all that will be, yes. Desolation. Peace is a mark of God's consoling presence. Then it is reasonable that a feeling of abandonment by God, or the sense that traveling the wrong path shows itself in lack of peace. Desolation reveals itself in deep inner anxiety, where despite the best efforts of friends or family members to provide consolation, peace or joy cannot be found. The period of desolation as a time of darkness in the soul, turmoil of spirit, listlessness, ambivalence, indecisiveness, and restlessness that can lead to lack of faith, hope, and love. A basic sadness subsists within the soul that renders it lost and separated from its Creator and Lord. Just as consolation brings inner peace, desolation results in lack of peace, confusion, and darkness. The period of desolation is difficult to persevere through because this period of darkness is sometimes accompanied by feeling of abandonment, emptiness, or failure. The heart experiences a conflict of movements, and the desire for the highest good is obscured by darkness, silence, or the inability to choose what is the highest good. Beginners in the spiritual life are often vulnerable to desolation because they try to control their spiritual lives rather than entrusting them to God. When self-will prevails over God's will, we may leave the front door of our hearts open for evil spirits to enter, bringing with them discouragement, anxiety, restlessness, fear, and loss of peace. God is always faithful to us, but we must choose God even in times of desolation. If we choose to remain in desolation indefinitely, as if a lack of peace and joy may be God's will for us, we will miss out on life and on the opportunity to love God in new ways. God does not desire our unhappiness, nor does God dwell where there is no peace. Rather, God desires the fullness of life for us. In time of desolation, never to make a change, but to be firm and constant in the resolution and determination in which one was day preceding such desolation, or in determination in which it is sometimes preceding consolation and is difficult to find our way out of all this. Desolation can be a time of growth when we trust God by letting go of our fears, expectations, or sense of failure and allowing God's grace to enter in. The depth of our love may be tested in the desolation of the desert so that we may truly belong to God. I offer you some reflection questions. When have you felt a glimmer of God's presence, and how did you know? What criteria do I use to make decisions in my life? Do I make decisions out of a free heart or one that is heavy with cares and anxieties? How do I recognize desolation in my life? How have I coped with it? Do I try to escape it, or do I see it as graced time? My beloved friends, this evening, it's a very, very in-depth one. And this evening does not have to be the evening that everything is in its right place. These evenings are a pad to use for the way that your life follows Christ. Guidance and discern the will of God. And yes, if we are truly honest, there are deserts. There is desolation. But remember this: wherever you are, God is there. Maybe how difficult to understand this on this very moment. God is near, and He waits for you. May you find peace within.